to those of you who've been with me since day one. We are reading through the Gospels this month, and this week I want you to read the Gospel of John. Okay, we've just read Matthew and Mark. We're going to skip Luke and do him next week so we can segue from Luke straight into Acts for reasons I mentioned last week. So this week we are reading the fourth Gospel, which for us will be our third Gospel. And for one, I'm really grateful that we have the Gospel of John. There is so much in John. 90% of John's Gospel content is unique. We don't have it in the other three Gospels. That's why the other three are called the Synoptic Gospels. They basically follow the same synopsis, but John, totally different. 90% of his content is unique, and John, in order to fit it in the Gospel, therefore omits a whole bunch of stuff that the other Gospels include. It is a really, really unique read. And we came to appreciate this when we read through the Old Testament together. You know, when we read Kings and then Chronicles, they basically tell the same story with most of the same characters, but Chronicles had a really different perspective and nuance and purpose and priority behind its writing. So it read really differently. We really found this in the Old Testament when we read the prophets and the Psalms together with the narrative, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. When we read the prophets at the same time, they exposed to us the real heart behind what was happening. Where the narrative was often very plain and straightforward, the prophets would come in and tell us what was happening in heaven at that time or what was on God's heart in that time. They'd use very different language and give us a real different perspective on what was happening on the ground. Well, that's why we have four Gospels, all right? They are each to give us a unique perspective on the most important character in the whole Bible, Jesus Christ himself. And John's Gospel is really different to the other three. If the four Gospels are like a quartet, okay, like a singing group, then John's the baritone. I mean, you can really hear him. He comes in and goes out at different places. He sings a very different line to the other three, but together they paint a beautiful picture of who Jesus is. So I know you are really going to enjoy John's Gospel this week. A lot of stuff is new you haven't seen before, and we would not have if we didn't have John's Gospel, and therefore a whole bunch of stuff is left out. And there's different theories for that, all from the fact that, you know, maybe John's Gospel was the last written, so the author deliberately left stuff out and don't want to reinvent the wheel. Maybe it's because John, the author, was really different to the other authors. Most people believe that the Gospel was written by John the Apostle. Church history sort of tells us that, but there is reason to believe that it's not John the Apostle, that the author was actually another John. There was an old church historian called Papias in the 1st century who seems to indicate that there's a difference between John the Apostle and John the author, or John the elder. And maybe that is why, you know, that John's Gospel has a real different feel. And I'm not going to go into all that today. If you're interested, I actually did a preaching series on John's Gospel at the start of 2018. It's on Bayside's website, baysidechurch.org.au. The series was called Revealed, the 7 signs of Jesus in the Gospel of John. And on the opening sermon there, I talk about some of the things about the potential authorship, so I won't go into that now. Needless to say that this Gospel is really unique. It is written by a man who claims to be the disciple Jesus loved. Fascinating. All right, anyway, enjoy John's Gospel this week. These are 3 things that I really noticed, that I picked up on, even though I've preached on John earlier this year. As I read through John afresh this week, there are 3 things I want to bring to your attention as you read through this Gospel. His language, his location, and his lordship. All right? Language, location, I can't help it. Language, location, and lordship. 3 things relevant to our big picture view as we read through the whole Bible this year. First thing I want you to do is pay attention to Jesus's language this week, or really John, the author's language. On one hand, John's Gospel is full of really clear contrasts. Law and grace, light and dark, day and night, spirit and flesh, above, below, heavenly, earthly, this mountain, that mountain. There's very clear contrast in the Gospel of John. Yet at the other hand, as always, it is full of nuance. It is full of figures of speech. One of them that's really fascinating, I want you to maybe pay attention to, is an often recurring phrase where Jesus speaks of, or John speaks of, the world. And often You know, you and I, when we read in the Bible and it says the world, we think planet Earth. You know, we've got Google Maps. We grew up in a school with a globe on the teacher's desk. We know what the world is. It means the planet. But often in this gospel, when he speaks of the world, he speaks of the Jewish world. He speaks of the world, the old covenant world that Jesus was primarily ministering into. Just keep that in mind as you read this week. As you keep coming across that passage, the world, ask yourself, does it mean the planet or does it mean the Jewish world, the specific world that Jesus is called to minister into? All right, so just keep that in mind. There's a lot of nuance and figures of speech in this gospel. Like the other gospels, it is full of Old Testament references. You're going to see quotes in there from the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And not just direct quotes, but also subtle allusions, all right? And so like the opening chapter, the Word became flesh and he became the light of man. It's an obvious allusion to Genesis, the Genesis creation story. Jesus' first miracle, turning water into wine, is an obvious allusion to Moses' first miracle, where Moses, his first plague, where he turned water into blood. Jesus comes. The law came through Moses. Jesus comes full of grace and truth and doesn't turn water into blood. No. He turns water into wine. It's an illusion. The author is saying this Jesus is like Moses. He is the prophet like Moses that we've been waiting for. And then there's other subtle things. I noticed this week, Jesus speaking. Remember this prophetic promise that God's people have about the two kingdoms of Israel being united again? Remember the kingdom of Judah in the south, Israel in the north, and the prophets kept saying, don't worry, one day those kingdoms will be reunited. Well, there's a number of references in Jesus' teaching where he talks about those kingdoms coming back together again. Even Caiaphas, the high priest who prophesies about Jesus dying for the people, prophesies that Jesus' death will bring about the reunification of those kingdoms. It's subtle, but it's there. It's an illusion, and I want you to pay attention to that. So point number one, pay attention, as always, to the language of this gospel. Number two, I want you to pay attention to the location of this gospel. One of the things that makes John unique is that it shows much of Jesus' ministry in different locations. With the other three gospels, basically half of them, the first half of each gospel, is spent all up in Galilee, Capernaum, Nazareth, out bush, basically, in the fishing villages. And then Jesus comes down to Jerusalem to be killed. Well, John says, no. I'm writing a gospel very different to that. He tells us that there's a lot of stuff in Jesus' ministry that happened in Jerusalem. After all, Jesus was a Jewish man. He went to Jerusalem 3 times a year at least, for the feast that he had to go through, Passover and Tabernacles and all that kind of thing. So Jesus was often in Jerusalem. So this gospel spends a lot of time with Jesus ministering at the temple in the capital city, okay, basically in Jerusalem. So his location is really different. And John wants us to know, or this author wants us to know, that Jesus had a massive influence in Jerusalem. He didn't just have big crowds in Galilee, he had massive crowds in the capital city. The biggest one, of course, being Palm Sunday, because Lazarus had risen from the dead, a story not told in the other Gospels. Jesus comes into the city with thousands and thousands of people hailing him as king. So I want you to pay attention to that. You're not going to see much of that Jerusalem-focused ministry in the other Gospels. Number one, pay attention to the language. Number two, pay attention to the location. And number three, the other thing that really got my attention this week is Jesus' lordship. There is a real emphasis in this gospel that Jesus is always in charge. Now, I've said to you right from the outset that these tutorials aren't about personal devotional things, but that could very well be something that some of you just need to hear this week and see this week in the gospel. Jesus is Lord. Jesus is in charge, all right? He is in complete control. At one point, the crowds want to make him king, and yet he refuses because he says, my time has not yet come. I'm not going to be made king on your terms. I'll become king on my terms when my hour has come. When under threat from other people who threaten to kill him, he walks through the crowd unscathed. Why? Because he is in control. He says, I lay down my life when it's my time to do so. I have the authority to do do that. When Pilate says to him, hey, I've got the authority to kill you, Jesus looks him in the eye and says, no, you don't, mate. You don't have any authority other than what my Father has given you. I will lay down my life when I'm good and ready. Thank you very much. When at the temple, and people try to arrest him, but they're so enamored by his teaching, they're just so stunned, they can't bring themselves to arrest him. When they come to the garden to arrest him, people with clubs in their hands, they say, are you Jesus? He says, I am he. And it says the soldiers collapse to the ground like a sack of potatoes, just hit the ground, bam, under the weight of his glory. They can't even arrest him without his permission. Jesus is Lord. The Word, God himself, made flesh. Jesus is Lord. And that is one of the main emphases of this gospel. All right? I want you to pay attention to the language of this gospel. I want you to pay attention to the location in which Jesus is ministering. And thirdly, please pay attention to the lordship of Christ and just how much he is in control no matter what the crowds are saying, the fickle crowds around him. Jesus is in full control of what is taking place. All right? So keep those three things in mind. And as I said before, if you want to go onto our website or subscribe to our iTunes and listen to a series that we preached at the start of 2018. It's called Revealed, the 7 signs of Jesus in the Gospel of John. I think you'll enjoy that if you want to listen to some more from John's Gospel this week. All right, bless you guys heaps. Next week, heading into Luke and then Acts, but don't worry about that. I'll talk more about that then. Enjoy Luke this week. Bless you, and thanks for joining me. Bye.
That's it for today's lesson. I really hope you enjoy your readings this week. Remember, allow yourself time to read as much as you can in one sitting. Don't get lost in the detail. Just keep going and watch the Bible's big story unfold before you. Remember also to hit me up on our social media channels or website, and I'll see you next time.